In the complex world of international commerce, few developments have raised as many eyebrows as what unfolded in early 2025. China, the planet's most voracious consumer of soybeans, made a stunning announcement that sent ripples through global agricultural markets. It was halting soybean purchases from Brazil, its primary supplier for years. Almost simultaneously, Beijing revealed something equally surprising. Chinese grain authorities had secured contracts for 1.25 million metric tons of American soybeans, with shipments scheduled to begin arriving in April. To anyone following the trajectory of global trade over the past decade, this decision seemed paradoxical. After all, Brazil and China have cultivated deep economic bonds as fellow BRICS nations, building what many considered an unshakable partnership. Meanwhile, Washington and Beijing have spent years locked in various degrees of economic confrontation, viewing each other as strategic rivals on the world stage. So what could possibly explain China's pivot back toward American agriculture? Some analysts have pointed to a brewing controversy involving BYD, the Chinese electric vehicle manufacturer, and allegations that emerged from its operations in Brazil. The Brazilian government leveled serious accusations against the company, claiming labor violations at a factory construction site, charges that Chinese officials vehemently disputed as distorted and unfair. Could this diplomatic friction have triggered a calculated economic response from Beijing? In the analysis that follows, we'll unpack the layers of this agricultural trade drama. We'll examine why China decided to pull back from Brazilian soybeans, what motivated the return to American suppliers, and what this tells us about the evolving landscape of global commerce in an era of shifting alliances and economic statecraft. Before we dive deeper, if you find value in content that breaks down complex international developments into clear, accessible insights, consider subscribing to stay informed about stories that shape our interconnected world. Now, let's explore what's really happening in the global soybean market. The soybean superpowers. Understanding the global landscape. To appreciate the significance of recent developments, we need to first understand the sheer scale of the global soybean industry. Two nations stand as undisputed giants in this market: Brazil and the United States. According to the most recent agricultural data from 2024, Brazil harvested an extraordinary 128 million metric tons of soybeans, claiming the top position worldwide. Not far behind, the United States produced approximately 126 million tons, securing second place. Together, these two agricultural powerhouses essentially control the flow of soybeans across the planet, dictating prices and availability for importers everywhere. On the demand side of the equation stands China, a nation whose appetite for soybeans dwarfs all others. Chinese industries and consumers require more than 140 million metric tons annually, a staggering figure that reflects both the country's massive population and its dietary preferences. This immense demand has positioned China as the dominant force in global soybean purchasing, accounting for over 60% of all international soybean trade. To put this in perspective, imagine if a single customer walked into a global marketplace and purchased more than half of one particular product category. That's essentially China's position in the soybean world, a buyer so significant that its decisions can reshape entire agricultural economies overnight. The changing of the guard, from American dominance to Brazilian supremacy. What many observers today may not realize is that the current trade pattern represents a relatively recent shift in global agricultural commerce. Rewind to the period before 2018, and you'd find a very different picture. Back then, the United States served as China's primary soybean supplier, at one point capturing an impressive 80% of the Chinese market. American farmers had built robust supply chains to Chinese ports, and the relationship appeared stable and mutually beneficial. Then came the trade tensions of 2018, when the Trump administration launched what would become a prolonged trade confrontation with China, imposing tariffs and restrictions across numerous sectors. The agricultural relationship became collateral damage. Chinese buyers, whether acting on government direction or simple economic calculation, began looking elsewhere for their soybean needs. Brazil seized this opportunity with remarkable speed and efficiency. Within just a few years following the outbreak of trade hostilities between Washington and Beijing, Brazilian agricultural exporters had essentially replaced their American competitors in the Chinese market. By the period spanning 2019 through 2024, Brazil was supplying more than 70% of China's imported soybeans, while the American share had collapsed to less than 30%. This wasn't merely a shift in soybean trade. As Brazilian agricultural products flowed into Chinese markets, the commercial relationship broadened and deepened. Chinese importers increased their purchases of Brazilian corn, cooking oils, various meat products, and other agricultural commodities. The economic partnership flourished, with bilateral trade between the two nations surging past $180 billion in 2024 alone. In fact, China has maintained its position as Brazil's largest trading partner for 15 consecutive years, with annual commerce exceeding the $100 billion threshold for 6 straight years. From São Paulo to Shanghai, this partnership seemed unbreakable. Built on complementary needs, geographic convenience, and shared membership in the BRICS coalition of emerging economies. The suspension that shook the market. Against this backdrop of apparent stability and mutual prosperity, the announcement in February 2025 landed like a thunderclap. Chinese customs authorities declared they would no longer accept soybean shipments from 5 Brazilian companies, effectively freezing a significant portion of Brazil-China agricultural trade. The official explanation centered on phytosanitary concerns, essentially plant health and safety standards. According to statements from Chinese customs officials, products from these companies had failed to meet the required health benchmarks for imported agricultural goods. While the specific names of the 5 affected companies weren't immediately disclosed to the public, industry sources quickly identified one major player: Cargill's Brazilian operations. Reports indicated that China had ceased accepting soybean shipments from Cargill, Brazil beginning in January 2025, shortly before the broader announcement. 3 additional Brazilian exporters soon found themselves in similar circumstances, unable to ship their products to Chinese ports. The scale of this suspension cannot be understated. These 5 companies collectively represented approximately 30% of Brazil's total soybean exports to China. In the world of agricultural trade, where volumes are measured in millions of tons, and profit margins can be razor-thin, losing access to such a massive market segment represented a potentially catastrophic blow. The timing added another layer of complexity. South America was in the early stages of its soybean harvest season when the suspension was announced, meaning supplies were relatively tight. However, industry forecasters predicted that as the harvest reached its peak in subsequent weeks, the volume of available soybeans would surge dramatically. Under normal circumstances, this would represent a prime opportunity for exporters. Instead, Brazilian companies faced the prospect of bumper crops with nowhere to send them. Faced with this economic curveball, Brazilian agricultural authorities moved quickly to contain the fallout. Government representatives sought to reassure domestic farmers that the situation, while concerning, wouldn't devastate the overall export picture. Official statements emphasized that Brazilian soybean exports to China would continue, characterizing the suspension as a limited issue affecting specific companies rather than a complete breakdown of the trading relationship. Behind the scenes, Brazilian diplomatic and agricultural officials reportedly initiated urgent communications with their Chinese counterparts. The goal was straightforward: provide whatever documentation, certifications, or explanations might be necessary to lift the temporary embargo and restore full market access as quickly as possible. For Brazilian farmers and agricultural businesses, the stakes couldn't be higher. China doesn't just represent a significant market, it represents the lifeblood of Brazil's agricultural export economy. Losing sustained access to Chinese buyers would force Brazilian producers to scramble for alternative markets that simply don't exist at comparable scale. While Brazilian exporters worked to salvage their relationship with Beijing, another remarkable development was unfolding on the other side of the world. China's state grain purchasing agency, China Grain Reserves Corporation, was making moves that would have seemed improbable just months earlier. In late 2024, the corporation purchased 500,000 metric tons of American soybeans, the first significant purchase from U.S. suppliers in years. Then, in early 2025, another order followed, 750,000 metric tons. Combined, these purchases totaled 1.25 million tons, with delivery scheduled for March and April. For those who had watched U.S.-China trade relations deteriorate over the previous administration, this represented a startling reversal. Why would Beijing suddenly extend what appeared to be an olive branch to Washington? The questions multiplied when the pricing details emerged. According to reports from American agricultural media, China had agreed to pay approximately 90 cents per bushel above the Chicago Board of Trade March futures price, and 80 cents above the May futures. Compared to the prevailing Brazilian soybean prices at the time, American soybeans cost roughly 80 cents to a full dollar more per bushel. Think about that for a moment. China, known for driving hard bargains in international negotiations, was voluntarily paying a premium to purchase American soybeans instead of cheaper Brazilian alternatives. In the world of commodity trading, where pennies per unit can translate to millions of dollars over large volumes, this decision demanded explanation. To understand the context behind China's shifting agricultural purchases, we need to examine a parallel story that had been developing in Brazil's automotive sector, one that would strain the goodwill between the two nations. Brazil had been actively courting Chinese investment in electric vehicle manufacturing, recognizing both the environmental imperative of transitioning to cleaner transportation and the economic opportunity of partnering with China's technological leaders in this field. BYD, one of the world's largest electric vehicle manufacturers, responded with a commitment to invest $1 billion in Brazilian factory construction. This represented a win-win scenario on paper. Brazil would gain manufacturing capacity, employment opportunities, and access to cutting-edge EV technology. Chinese companies would establish a foothold in South America's largest economy, creating a platform for regional expansion. The partnership seemed to embody the kind of South-South cooperation that both nations had championed. Then came the allegations that would poison the relationship. In late 2024, Western media outlets published reports claiming that Chinese workers at the BYD construction site in Brazil were subjected to exploitative labor conditions. The accusations were serious and specific. Workers' passports allegedly confiscated, wages supposedly split into installments with only 40% paid monthly, 10-hour workdays, substandard housing without basic furnishings, and grossly inadequate sanitation facilities with 31 workers sharing a single toilet. The term slave labor began appearing in headlines, a loaded phrase that carries profound historical and emotional weight, particularly in Brazil given its own complex history with slavery. What made the situation particularly inflammatory was the response from Brazilian authorities. Rather than launching an impartial investigation to determine the facts, Brazil's Labor Department appeared to lend credibility to the allegations, echoing the accusations made in Western media without conducting thorough due diligence. BYD moved quickly to deny the charges and promised to address any legitimate concerns about working conditions. However, Western media outlets continued amplifying the story, framing it as evidence of predatory Chinese business practices abroad. Chinese government representatives, including spokespeople for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, issued clarifications and defended the company, characterizing the reports as distorted and motivated by competitive rather than humanitarian concerns. Despite these efforts at damage control, the consequences were severe. Brazilian authorities ultimately issued a stop work order for the factory construction, bringing the billion-dollar project to a halt and creating precisely the kind of international incident that both governments had hoped to avoid. Economic statecraft reading between the lines. Against this backdrop, the decision to suspend Brazilian soybean imports takes on additional dimensions. While Chinese officials cited technical phytosanitary standards as the reason, many international observers detected a message being sent. In the world of international relations, countries rarely impose economic consequences in isolation from diplomatic context. China's vast import needs give it considerable leverage over supplier nations, and, Beijing has shown willingness to use market access as a tool of statecraft when relationships sour. The suspension of soybean imports, combined with another significant development, suggested a pattern. Around the same time, China's Ministry of Commerce announced an investigation into imported beef, a sector in which Brazil also plays a major role in supplying the Chinese market. The stated reason for the beef investigation related to domestic Chinese industry concerns. Representatives from China's beef sector had reportedly requested protection from what they characterized as unfairly priced imports that were undermining domestic producers. Chinese beef prices had indeed been declining, reflecting both increased supply and weakened consumer demand in certain market segments. Officials carefully noted that the investigation wouldn't target any specific country and would be conducted without discrimination based on origin. However, the timing and context didn't escape notice in Brasilia. Brazil ranks among China's top beef suppliers, and any findings that resulted in new restrictions or tariffs would inevitably impact Brazilian exporters. The investigation was slated to last 8 months starting in February 2025, though officials noted the timeline could be extended under special circumstances. For Brazilian agricultural interests, this represented months of uncertainty about access to a market they'd come to depend on. The American dimension. Trump, tariffs, and trade diplomacy. To fully understand China's pivot toward American soybeans, we also need to consider the changing political landscape in Washington. Donald Trump had returned to the White House with an agenda that placed trade policy at its center. Trump's business background and his focus on trade deficits and economic nationalism were well established from his first term. Throughout his campaign, he emphasized his intention to leverage tariff policy to reshape America's trading relationships, promising to make America great again through more assertive economic statecraft. Once inaugurated, Trump's administration did indeed take a harder line on various China-related issues than his predecessor. Rhetoric about strategic competition intensified, and new policy measures were introduced across several domains. However, there were also, subtle signs of calibration, moments when the temperature seemed to cool slightly, creating openings for dialogue. For China's leadership, managing this relationship required delicate balancing. Beijing needed to demonstrate strength and defend its interests, but it also needed to avoid an uncontrolled escalation that could damage both economies. Creating space for negotiation while maintaining leverage became the strategic imperative. Purchasing American agricultural products, particularly soybeans, offered a way to send a signal without making irreversible concessions on more sensitive issues. It demonstrated that China remained open to productive economic engagement with the United States when terms were reasonable. It created goodwill with an important American constituency, farmers and agricultural businesses in politically significant states, without compromising China's positions on technology, security, or sovereignty questions. In essence, buying American soybeans, even at a premium price, represented a form of economic diplomacy. It cost relatively little in the grand scheme of China's trillion-dollar economy, but it communicated something valuable: Beijing's willingness to find pragmatic solutions and avoid unnecessary confrontation when possible. The soybean weapon: lessons from previous trade conflicts. History offered a clear lesson about the role soybeans could play in United States-China economic confrontations. During the previous round of trade tensions, American soybean farmers became some of the most visible casualties. When China dramatically reduced its purchases of United States soybeans during that period, American exports to China plummeted by nearly 80%. For farmers across the American heartland, in states like Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana, where soybeans represent a critical crop, the impact was devastating. Economic analyses estimated that American agricultural interests suffered approximately $11 billion in losses as a result of lost Chinese market access. These weren't abstract statistics. They translated to farm foreclosures, reduced incomes for rural families, strain on agricultural lending institutions, and political pressure on elected officials from affected regions. The soybean market became a vivid illustration of how interconnected modern economies really are, and how trade disputes create real human consequences far from the negotiating tables where decisions are made. For Chinese policymakers, this history demonstrated that agricultural imports represented a point of leverage, a way to inflict measurable economic and political pain on American constituencies should relations deteriorate again. But it also worked in reverse. Restoring purchases could ease pressure, create stakeholders in the relationship, and provide tangible evidence of productive engagement. Looking ahead, there's a lot of uncertainty in the global agricultural order. As we assess these recent developments, several questions remain unanswered. Will Brazil successfully address China's stated concerns about phytosanitary standards and restore full market access for all its exporters? Will the BYD controversy fade into the background, or does it represent a more fundamental shift in how China evaluates its economic partnerships with countries that allow negative narratives about Chinese businesses to gain traction? For American farmers, the renewed Chinese purchases offer hope, but also caution. They remember how quickly market access evaporated before, and they understand that their economic fortunes remain vulnerable to political decisions made in Washington and Beijing. The premium prices China currently pays for American soybeans suggest strong demand, but also raise questions about sustainability. Will Beijing continue paying more when cheaper alternatives become available again? The broader implications extend beyond agriculture. These developments remind us that in an era of economic interdependence, trade relationships serve multiple purposes. They're about commerce, certainly, moving goods across borders to where they're needed and valued. But they're also about signaling, about leverage, about creating mutual dependencies that can either stabilize relationships or provide pressure points when conflicts emerge. Brazil's experience illustrates the risks of overdependence on any single export market, no matter how large or seemingly reliable. When more than 70% of your soybean exports flow to one buyer, that buyer inevitably gains influence over your economic well-being and, by extension, your policy choices. Diversification isn't just about risk management. It's about maintaining autonomy. For China, the episode demonstrates both the power and the limitations of using market access as a diplomatic tool. Suspending imports sends a message and creates pressure, but it also creates gaps in supply chains that need to be filled, potentially at higher cost. And in agriculture, where harvest cycles and planting decisions operate on annual rhythms, disruptions can have consequences that ripple through multiple seasons. The bigger picture here is agriculture in an age of strategic competition. What we're witnessing in the global soybean market reflects larger patterns reshaping international commerce. As great power competition intensifies, particularly between the United States and China, economic relationships increasingly serve strategic purposes beyond simple commercial logic. Agricultural trade, once considered relatively apolitical, driven by harvest yields, dietary needs, and commodity prices, has become another arena where nations pursue broader objectives. Food security concerns, always present in the background, have moved closer to the foreground of strategic thinking. Nations are reassessing the wisdom of extreme specialization and dependence on complex global supply chains that can be disrupted by conflicts, pandemics, or political decisions. We're likely entering an era where agricultural trade patterns will be less stable, more politically influenced, and more explicitly linked to diplomatic relationships than they were in the globalization optimism of the 1990s and early 2000s. This doesn't mean a return to autarky or the collapse of international agricultural commerce, but it does suggest more volatility and more conscious effort by governments to ensure diverse supply sources and reduce critical vulnerabilities. For observers trying to make sense of global affairs, the soybean story offers valuable insights. It shows us that understanding modern geopolitics requires looking beyond traditional security issues to embrace the complex interplay of agriculture, trade, technology, labor standards, public narratives, and economic statecraft. It reminds us that in our interconnected world, a labor dispute at a factory construction site in one country can influence agricultural purchasing decisions worth billions of dollars. In conclusion, the harvest of complexity. The tale of China's shifting soybean purchases, moving away from Brazil while returning to American suppliers, cannot be reduced to a single explanation. It's not simply about plant health standards, though those may be genuinely relevant. It's not only about the BYD controversy, though that clearly strained relations.